Fantastic. Thank you so much, Meredith. And I want to thank Meredith and Allison for all of the programming that they have been doing for our alums. You know, they have really recreated our alumni programming. And so we're so, so grateful for that. I also want to start with thanking Tim and Brian for making this possible for us tonight. I'm really excited to learn more about whiskey. I'm not a big whiskey drinker, and so I'm eager to learn more. And so thank you for making that possible. So let's, it's kind of what I want to do is just give a brief overview of where we've been in the last year, if that sounds appropriate to everyone. And I'm going to share my screen here. Let me just pull this up for us share, present. And I'm going to do this relatively quickly, but I also am open if you want to ask questions during this reception, please do. It's let's make it informal because I think it will be a good opportunity for us just to hear what's going on and what are you interested in hearing about, so that because there's been so much going on. So here we go. I'm just trying to pull up. I apologize. I've got the wrong document here in front of me. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so you can see here, some photos of what school has looked like this year. We have been so lucky to be in school for the most part, and we'll talk about what that's looked like. But you'll see some images. It looks the same, right? While there are people wearing masks and students socially distanced, life is the same at St. Stephen's and St. Agnes in so many ways, and we've been so blessed to be able to do that. So if we, when we closed our campus on March 14th, we were focused on, okay, well, what will the next couple of weeks look like, right? What is life going to be, for how will we do distance learning? And it was amazing that, we then realized very quickly, because the governor said we're going to be closed until June, that we had to reimagine the whole rest of the year. The creativity, resilience, and flexibility of the community ensured we would not just survive this time, but that we would be stronger as a community on the other side of it. The Board of Governors very quickly said that is our goal, right? Not just to tread water during this time, but to be even better at the end of this. So we reimagined time-honored traditions. You can see here in the top left, we couldn't do commencement as we normally would at the seminary. So we did a drive-through diploma conferring ceremony at the upper school. It was wonderful, and I imagine it will become a tradition for us for years to come. We had Zoom classes, as you can see here. We had, distance learning down here on the bottom right. We also honored our seniors. That was really important to us, that we made sure our seniors got honored. We held concerts, athletic team activities, talent shows, and coffee houses all online. And we honored our 5th and 8th graders as well. It was really not ideal, but I could say our teachers did it just about as well as anyone across our country. And I was so proud of how our teachers navigated this time. At the end of the school year, during the final days, we witnessed and felt the anger, the frustration, and pain from the atrocity of racial injustices in our country. And it became clear that while we have worked very hard to seek equity within our community, there are those who we call saints who are in our community who felt pain and are still feeling that pain more acutely than others. And we knew that in moment that we were doing a lot, but we were not doing enough. We did that summer, developed St. Stephen's and St. Agnes action steps for racial justice. That calls us to review our curriculum, our hiring policies, as well as focus how we can strengthen our alumni partnership. Last week, our alumni of color were invited to meet with our students, current students in their affinity groups. And that's just one example of the really important work that the Action Steps for Racial Justice continues to guide for us. Then September came. We were so excited to hear young voices on campus, whether playing on our playgrounds or connecting with teachers under tents or driving robots in the courtyard. There was nothing better than being back together. We started back on campus with our youngest saints being back a full time. Since our return, there's been no transmission, very little transmission on campus, I should say, and no outbreaks. And we've not been required to close our campuses. And I think that was because we took a very measured approach to reopening. We opened in phases, and because our families have been diligent about keeping our community safe. So just to highlight some of these photos here, you can see, a lower school saint, right, building with Legos just as they would. Here, Thanksgiving service, I don't know, hopefully all of you remember the angel pins at Thanksgiving. That's been a tradition since the merger of the schools. While we couldn't all gather together, here is a kindergartner and a senior sharing an angel pin. Our bands have been playing. This is outdoor chapel science class, for example. Our students have not missed a beat academically, even though some are not on campus every single day. The strength of the robust academic programs have been evidenced these last few months, whether it's through challenging science experiments, progress on learning to read or learning to make friends, thoughtful and engaging English and history projects, intensive math assessments, and AP preparation. I've seen our students on Zoom with their classmates. It's amazing. They're able to conjugate verbs, debate, reflect, and learn together. Outside of academics, we've also continued to reimagine new traditions. You can see our blessing of the animals here. That is an important tradition in our community. Our robotics team here continues to work together. These are students on campus. We have used our outdoor spaces even more, and our athletics programs have continued. What I would say is this opening of school has required everyone. It has required every member of our community to support the work that we're doing. So, whether that is daily screenings where we do a health assessment and we do a temperature check, whether that is supporting our teachers who have worked harder this year than they've ever had to work before. It is amazing to see our students on campus, the joy you see with them hanging with their peers over lunch or getting something that they've really been struggling with, or in an impromptu karaoke. It's just awesome coming to school. Right now, we're working towards moving forward with more activities on campus. We're hoping to have all of our middle schoolers back starting on March the 1st, and our upper schoolers, we're hoping to bring more and more students back on that front. Let's take a quick minute. I mentioned community metrics. We've been on campus for 112 days. We have had a number of positive cases and quarantines, and we've had one potential transmission with our youngest saints who it's virtually impossible to socially distance at 6 feet. We have been so grateful because of for the Alexandria Health Department, who has been a tremendous partner through this. To be honest, I had never really worked with the Alexandria Health Department, and now they have become very close friends. And we work very closely with them on any cases that we have on campus, as well as on vaccinations. And so we've had many of our teachers having received their second dose of the vaccine in recent days. So we're thrilled and grateful about that. So now that I've shared kind of a little bit about what's been going on campus, let me first ask if there are any questions before I move to kind of some of the bigger strategic long-term priorities that we're focused on. Any questions about kind of what's been going on since May of last year, or excuse me, March of last year? Great. Well, let me shift to a couple of strategic priorities. As you all know, we have three wonderful campuses, and they have served our community well. In 2014, when we did our strategic plan, one of the priorities of that strategic plan was campus master planning and examining the three campuses and exploring the most important opportunities for us as a community in terms of our facilities. Through that assessment, we determined that the project at the upper school was going to be most important to the long-term health of St. Stephen's and St. Agnes. So let me talk a little bit about a project that we're working on at the upper school. So this is a picture of the outside of the dining hall and the science wing. Right, if we, I'm gonna back up for 1 second here. If we, if we take up the front of the school is here, baseball field is right here. As you come in, this is the back. This is overlooking Kelleher Field. What you may know, this space in our campus is not beautiful. Our science facilities have not changed since the 60s. Our dining hall is not meeting our purposes fully at this point. So we really have spent the last year developing a state-of-the-art facility where our students can easily congregate, collaborate, catch up with a teacher, and share a meal. It's very exciting. And so we will be sharing more about the upper school project in the coming months, but we've already making great progress on this and are beginning a campaign to support the work for this upper school project. It's very, very exciting. While this project alone will be transformational for the school, we also were presented with an opportunity to partner with a neighboring congregation to increase our campus footprint. Many of you who were at St. Stephen's may remember that you used to walk up the hill to St. Andrew's United Methodist Church for chapel. And so they own the property adjacent to our campus. So let me orient you for a minute. Here is the upper school. Here's the main circle. Here's Moss Field with the red track, Kelleher Field down here. And then if we, again, orient ourselves with Kelleher Field, Moss Field, you will notice this yellow line is what the property that is owned by St. Andrew's United Methodist Church. The church itself was in disrepair, and unfortunately the congregation did not have the resources to be able to update their facility in the way that they needed to. So they were in a financial crisis and were unsure of what to do with their facility. We are, through a partnership with them, we are able to acquire 2/3 of the land, and they will retain 1/3. The proceeds of the sale will pay for them to build a new church. So St. Stephen's and St. Agnes will acquire this yellow portion. The church will retain this red portion. They'll build a new church here. We will have access to our campus through Howard Street, and it will provide an additional building site where we will be able to sometime in the future build a new facility of some sort for the upper school or for the school in general. So we're thrilled about this opportunity. It is a strategic priority that will serve the school for generations to come, and we're really excited to imagine the possibilities. Okay. So I want to just end by saying thank you. Last year, our alumni supported the school with and gave more than $510,000 to the Saints Fund, our annual giving program. We are deeply grateful to the generous support and participation. If you haven't already heard, we are hosting the Saints Giving Day, a day-long philanthropic event for our entire community tomorrow on Tuesday, February 23rd. You'll notice my background is for Saints Giving Day. Members of our Board of Governors and our Alumni Association Board will match every gift up to $25,000. And if 100 gifts of any size are made, our school will receive an additional gift of $50,000 from an anonymous parent made in gratitude for our faculty and staff. We have had extraordinary expenses this year due to COVID, and the Saints Fund is even more important this year. So I hope that you will join us tomorrow in supporting the school with a gift and help inspire other Saints alumni to participate by spreading the word. It is through the continued support of our faculty, staff, students that we are able to dream big, to develop new schedules and programs to ensure our students are getting the very best possible academic experience, and to design spaces that will physically reflect our commitment to help our students become ready for life beyond St. Stephen's and St. Agnes. Again, I am so grateful to you all for being here tonight. I so missed being with everyone in person. While Zoom is wonderful, it is not all that we'd hoped for. I'm grateful to Tim and Brian for making this evening possible. I'm so excited to learn a little bit about whiskey, and I'll now turn it back to Meredith. And I also am happy to answer any questions about where life on campus, as well as our future priorities. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kirsten. Before Allison and I jump into introducing our guests, are there any questions that Kirsten can answer? Great. And if any come up, feel free to put them in the chat or email Allison or I later, and we'll get those to Kirsten as well. And for now, I'm going to pass it over to Allison to make our introductions.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight. And thank you, Kirsten, for all of your wonderful updates. I have the privilege of introducing our special host tonight. The Whiskey Library is the name of the company. Founded in 2014, the Whiskey Library is an education and events company by whiskey nerds for everyone based in Washington, D.C. The Whiskey Library helps people understand what a whiskey is and the differences between each style in a thoughtful and engaging experience, whether they're tasting their first dram or their 1000th. The Whiskey Library has worked with some of the best and most recognized names in Scotch, bourbon, and other whiskeys worldwide, including, and I might butcher a name, so I apologize, the Mcleod, Heaven Hill, the Glendronic, and has made custom blends and barrel picks with names like Compass Box, Elijah Craig, Whistle Pig, Old World, Jack Daniels, and 1-8 Distilling. With a wide network in the hospitality industry, the Whiskey Library team has judged cocktail competitions, consulted on whiskey offerings for award-winning fine dining restaurants, and their virtual tastings have been profiled in the Washington Post. Tonight, we are joined by the co-founders and local Saints alumni from the class of 2000, Brian Thompson and Tim Mole. Brian is co-founder and a senior whiskey educator at the Whiskey Library. He's been leading whiskey education events for both the Whiskey Library since its founding in 2014 and through other venues. Brian's whiskey collection, as you can see behind him tonight, includes over 300 unique bottles focusing on both Scotch and American whiskeys. Brian has collaborated with over a dozen major brands in the industry, helping them design special custom blends, leading numerous tastings, and working with each of their teams on various events. If he isn't sampling something new or working with clients to help them stock their private collections, Brian is probably sitting by a fire with a few bottles telling stories. Sounds pretty good. And Tim is also co-founder and a senior whiskey educator specializing in Scotch whiskey at the Whiskey Library. Tim is passionate about Scottish single malts and discovered his passion for whiskey when he received a bottle of Talisker 10 for Christmas. After realizing the complex and nuanced flavors of this bottle, he began exploring other single malt whiskeys. Tim loves diving into each distillery's history and the history of Scotland. When he's not hunting down a rare Scotch or leading a tasting, he is buried in a book with an interesting dram by his side. Brian and Tim, take it away.
Well, Allison, Meredith, Kirsten, thank you so much for having us here tonight. Sounds like I don't need to go into any more of our history. It sounds like you've done a great job for us already. We really appreciate that. So we're honored to be back with St. Stephen's and St. Agnes here this evening. Brian and I have known each other since the fall of 1994 when I started at the school on the lower school campus for 7th grade. And for the next 6 years, we weren't always the best friends, but as time went on, we certainly became a lot closer. And after school, we went our separate ways, but eventually made our ways back to the DC area and reconnected. And we were very, very fortunate to have been able to do so. And we eventually, like you said, Allison, we discovered that each of us had a passion for whiskey and wanted to find a way to share it with more of our friends who weren't quite as interested as we were. So we felt what better way than to teach them why we enjoy it so much. So we've been doing this for the last 7 years. Obviously, within the last year, it's transitioned from doing events in person to doing them online. But it's actually been a really great opportunity for our company to broaden our reach and to work with so many more different clients and customers around the country. And we're honored to be able to bring it back home, so to speak, and do something with the school that we're both very proud to have been a part of for so many years. Quite a few years ago now, it seems. But so thanks again for having us. And so let's get right into it, right? I know people don't want to hear us blab on too much more, and they have 4 whiskeys in front of them. So I'm going to ask the first whiskey that we're going to start with this evening is the Glendronic 18. So why doesn't everybody find that bottle and pour it in their glass, whichever one they have. Brian and I are going to be drinking out of a glass like this, these Glencairn nosing glasses, which are great. But if you don't have one of these, a brandy snifter is a great second option, or even a lowball glass will work just fine. And I'll pass it over to Brian for him to walk you through exactly how the best way is to go about nosing and tasting your whiskey.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. As Tim said, we're going to kind of get right into it for the night. So first thing is that I'm going to walk you through, at least on the first whiskey, the 4 pillars of whiskey tasting. All right. And so what that means is we're going to go over the appearance, the nose, the palate, and the finish. So first up is the appearance. How does the whiskey look? So for those that have already gone ahead and poured, some of you are actually already ahead of the game. That's exactly what you want to do. You want to take your glass, you want to hold it up at a little bit of an angle to a light source. And you just kind of want to kind of tilt it at a little angle. You're going to see some kind of light shining through. And really what this is if you kind of look at everybody else, you all look like you know what you're doing now. So that's the first step of whiskey drinking, is just making it look like you know what you're doing. But in all seriousness, there is more to the appearance than just that. And so you'll notice on this whiskey in particular, the Glendronic 18, it's a little redder than you would imagine, right? It's not that typical brown liquid, that you always hear, like whiskey is the brown spirit. That red hue gives you a hint of it's what the barrel was aged in, and in this instance, sherry. So the color can give you hints as to what it was aged in and how long it was aged. All of the color that you get out of a whiskey is coming from the barrel itself. So the longer it stays in that barrel, the darker it tends to become. And so again, the darker the whiskey, it tends to be an older whiskey. Those reddish hues will indicate a red wine finish of some kind, or that barrel had previously held a red wine. So that's the appearance. The next two phases are my favorite parts. So first, the nose. How does it smell? So for that, you want to go ahead and you want to hold your glass about an inch away from your nose. You want to part your lips and you want to breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And when you do that, you're really opening up your entire senses, and what you're able to do is you're really able to kind of get that airflow, and you're really able to pick up some of the more nuanced flavors. And so this is usually the part of the tasting where I stop and I encourage anybody to express what they're feeling out of this whiskey or sensing out of this whiskey. And I do want to emphasize that there are no wrong answers. I was fortunate enough to play golf at St. Stephen's, and let me tell you that whiskey drinking is a lot like golf. It's an individual sport, best played with friends. So that's kind of what whiskey is. There's no wrong answer. So anybody want to share what flavors they're getting out of this nose? Andrew.
Yeah, sure, Brian. I get kind of a gingery note. It's kind of like a brightly spicy, and then a flavor that I can only describe as wininess. Like it's a flavor and texture at the same time. That's kind of that has to do with how the kind of barrel that was used.
Absolutely.
Did I get it right?
There are no right or wrong answers, Andrew. Everybody can be right. If that's what you get, then you are indeed correct.
Very diplomatic.
Anybody else?
I'm getting vanilla.
There we go. Absolutely. So vanilla is one of those great flavors that is very typical in a lot of whiskeys. And we're going to get into exactly why vanilla is coming out in this one and in probably all of them. So there's again, I'm not going to get into kind of all of the different flavors. This one for a Scotch tends, in my book, to be a little sweeter. You get maybe a little bit of kind of raisins or dried prunes. Those are kind of some of the other kind of more common flavors you might get out of this one. Now, for the third phase of whiskey, of nosing and tasting, comes actually the tasting. And so this is the palate. And so for this, a gentle reminder, we're not taking shots tonight, at least not right now. We'll see how well we do here in the next 5 minutes. But you want to go ahead and you want to take a little bit of a sip. You want to kind of let it coat your entire palate, the front, the middle, and the back of your tongue, and really kind of get all of your taste buds involved in that. And so with that, cheers.
And again, if you're able to, let it sit on your tongue for a little while and even open your mouth while it's resting there and breathe over top of it. The oxygen is really going to be your friend in helping to bring out all of the flavors that this whiskey has inside.
I will say, for those of you that have not been doing whiskey tastings all day, if this is your first whiskey of the evening, it is probably a good time to have that second sip. That first one could have been a little bit jarring. And so go ahead and take that second sip. That tends to help out a little bit. The third sip gets even better, trust me. So again, what one of the fun parts about the palate, right, compared to the nose, not only do you get more bang for your buck, but you can get different flavor profiles, right? So what you smell is not necessarily what you taste. Some whiskeys are kind of very similar or consistent through nose and palate. Other ones are completely different. The nose is very stifled. And you might not be getting a whole lot, and then that palate really is where it comes to life, or vice versa. And so for this one, I kind of like it. It's more of a consistent flavor profile for me. What I got off of the nose was amplified off of the palate. So it's very enjoyable. Now the fourth portion of any kind of formal whiskey tasting is the finish. And so the finish is really just how it leaves you feeling at the end. Finishes are usually described as either long or short. What that really means is how long does it last in kind of the back of your throat or the back of your mouth, or on the palate. A long finish, it will last for a long period of time. You may not reach for that glass as often because you can kind of still, sense it with you. A short finish, it dissipates fast. That glass tends to get empty quicker than normal. The finish can also be another portion of your whiskey tasting experience where the flavor profile changes. So the finish can be just, sometimes Tim and I might describe something as funky, odd, interesting. Usually that means something has changed drastically from what we were sensing earlier. And so again, you can get different notes on the finish as well. They can become a little bit more floral. You might get a little bit of vanilla, or a different flavor. I definitely get a little bit of more of the vanilla that someone else mentioned earlier on the finish than I did on the palate. But again, there's no right or wrong answer on this. It's all about your experiences and what your flavors that you're getting out of it. So with that, we're not going to walk through tasting every single one that way. I encourage you to drink it at your own pace, at your own rate. But those are the four pillars, the four kind of key components of any whiskey tasting. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Scotch guy and let him talk a little bit more about what it is exactly we're drinking here with this Glendronic 18.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So now that we've had a little bit to drink, now let's get into the weeds a little bit here. So what is whiskey? Whiskey is a distilled spirit from fermented grains. Those grains could be barley, they could be corn, they could be rye, they could be wheat, they could even be things like quinoa or oats. But you're not going to see those very often simply because they don't make very good whiskey. But when you're talking about a single malt Scotch, what you're getting there is 100% malted barley. So whenever you hear the term single malt Scotch, that's what that means. The only grain contained within this whiskey is malted barley. And so a lot of people know what barley is. It's one of the most common cereal grains in the world, great food staple, big time in making beer, but it's also huge in the whiskey industry. But as far as what malted barley is, that's not something that people are quite as familiar with typically. So let me walk you through a little bit about what that is and how it comes to be. So in terms of malting barley, the first step is to harvest the grain. You're harvesting the barley. And what you do is you steep it in some water. You put it in, you take it out, you put it back in over the course of 40 to 48 hours. And what you're doing here is you're increasing the moisture content of the barley up to around 44%. And the goal here is you're faking the barley out into thinking that it's springtime so that it starts to germinate. And the reason that you want the barley to germinate is because in its natural state, barley is a very starch-dense grain. And you can't make alcohol out of starch. You need the sugars that are contained within. So with the germination process comes the transition from starches to sugars. So after you've done that for 40 to 48 hours, you would then typically lay it out on a malting floor, the traditional way of doing it. And what's happening here is you're giving it a period of time during which to start to take this transformation to its fullest extent. But you don't want to actually turn it in to a new grain or into a new plant. What you need to do is you need to stop it in its tracks. And that period comes after about 4 or 5 days. And so the way you do that is you kiln it, K-I-L-N. And so what that is from below, you typically heat it with a dry heat, something like an anthracite, which is a very dense coal fuel source. And this will heat the barley without lending any types of flavors to it. And this is preserving the sugars inside the barley to allow it to move on to the next phase. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But after this point, you would grind it down into a flour. You would mix it with some hot water in a mash tun. what you're doing here is you are separating the grain from the sugar water, which is called the wort. And then afterwards, you're going to be mixing that with yeast. And so to this point, anybody who likes beer is probably sensing that this is almost identical to the beer making process. And it really is up to this point, with the exception of the fact that there are no hops being added to the barley in the whiskey making process. And so when you're fermenting, what's happening there is the yeast is eating the sugars in this wort and it's excreting out alcohol, to be graphic about it. But this only gets it to about 7 to 12% alcohol. And so that's the strength of a nice beer, but that's certainly not the strength of what we're drinking in our glass here today. So after this point, you need to transfer it to something called a pot still. And so when we're talking again about single malt Scotch, that has to be done in a copper pot still. So if anybody's seen one of these gorgeous vessels before, it's a very wide bottomed copper pot with a neck that goes up the side, increasingly narrow as it goes up, and then it's got an arm that goes off the top. And so what's happening here is it's being heated typically by a steam heat. And since alcohol evaporates at 173 degrees and is a much more volatile than water, it is going to evaporate at a much higher rate than alcohol. So during the process of distillation, that's what's happening, is you have the alcohol separating itself from the majority of the water that remains down in the bottom of the still. And so what happens, it needs that copper contact along the still, and then it's a vapor, and then it's condensed back into a liquid after it comes out the top of the still. And it'll typically go through 2 distillation cycles. After the first, it's about 25 to 35% alcohol. And then after the second, it gets up to about 70% alcohol. And when it comes off the second still, it's completely clear, right? There's no color to it at all. It looks like water, looks like vodka, looks like gin. And so, as Brian mentioned, all of its color comes from the next phase, which is when it goes into the barrel. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through the evening with the different whiskeys. But this is the whiskey making process at its heart, as far as single malt Scotch is concerned. Any questions about that? I know that was a lot of information.
Hi, Tim. Could you talk about the peat that happens in the heat process? Because yeah, I just wondered about that. I think they use that as part of the heat process to give the flavor, right? Is that how they do it?
Absolutely, Scott. And you're getting a little bit ahead of me here. Our 4th whiskey is going to have a little bit of that peat in there, and we'll talk a little bit about that at that point. Is that fair? Thanks. Okay, cool. Brian, did you want, or I guess we'll talk a little.
So, I mean, I think, one of the things that we should have, or maybe I should have kind of clarified in the very beginning, right, is feel free to interrupt, right? Feel free to ask questions throughout this. We're really here for you guys for, well, as long as we can be. So any questions about the whiskeys we're drinking tonight or whiskey in general, right? This is exactly what we're here for. And also kind of, I wanted to highlight the whiskey that you're drinking right now with the Glendronic 18. Tim and I come from, different backgrounds in terms of our appreciation of whiskey. I definitely come from more of the American side with bourbons and ryes. Tim is definitely more on the single malts. In the company itself and our friends, there's been different favorites out there, right? Some people, will prefer this brand or this bottle. The Glendronic 18 somehow has managed to be the one whiskey that everybody we know has multiple bottles of. It tends to be one of the ones that everybody really, really tends to gravitate towards and really love. Whether you typically like bourbon or you typically like Scotch, the Glendronic 18 is kind of that beautiful kind of balance between all of the worlds. I think the other part that we're trying to get into with all 4 of these whiskeys are kind of the 4 must-haves on your bar. So whether it's the Glendronic 18, the Old Forester, the Rittenhouse, or the Talisker, all of which we're going to get into, that's really where the theme for tonight came out of, right? Which is, what are the 4 whiskeys that we really feel like you should have on your bar, and for what reasons? But Glendronic holds a special place, I think, in all of our hearts at the Whiskey Library.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And before we leave Glendronic, let me just tell you a little bit more about this distillery and where its flavors come from and why it tastes the way it does. So let me give you a little bit of the history. So Glendronic is a distillery that's just east of Speyside. So a lot of you may have heard the term Speyside before, but that's the most densely packed distillery region in Scotland, kind of in the northeastern part of the country. But Glendronic finds itself just outside of it to the east. And so this is a distillery that was founded in 1826. It's definitely had a little bit of an up and down history. In 1837, it caught on fire. And 5 years later, the gentleman, James Allardyce, who founded the distillery, had gone bankrupt. The distillery was only rebuilt 10 years later in 1852 and has undergone a number of ownership changes throughout the years. In fact, it was even owned by the government after World War I. And it was even mothballed from 1996 to 2002, meaning nobody was getting any whiskey from this distillery. But it now finds itself in the hands of Brown-Forman, which is the ownership group that also owns Jack Daniels. One thing that it has been consistent about the entire time, though, is its maturation in sherry casks. And the reason it does that, it chooses sherry casks over bourbon casks or virgin oak casks or different types of wine casks, is that its distillate really lends itself to sherry cask aging. Before I go there, let's talk about casks real quick. So we've talked about sherry casks. These are typically 500 or 700 liter vessels that come from Spain. Sherry is a fortified wine that comes from that country. And so they're much larger than the ex-bourbon barrels that are the predominant barrel type in Scotland, which are only about 200 liters, sometimes 250 liters big. The reason Glendronic does so well with sherry is because it has a much heavier distillate. And the reason it's heavier is because the stills are a little bit on the shorter side, which allows for a little bit heavier vapors to escape the top of the still. It also has a downward facing arm at the top, which lends again to heavier vapors being able to escape the still and not falling back down to be recondensed into a lighter spirit. And also it has a bigger heart's cut. So after the second distillation, there are harmful chemicals on the front end and some on the back end as well. So you don't get to capture all of the whiskey to then be aged. Portions of it have to go back to be redistilled in order to make it drinkable later on. But Glendronic takes a little bit wider chunk out of the middle, which makes for a little bit of a more flavorful and richer distillate that suits the maturation in sherry casks better than it does in bourbon casks. So, and all the distilleries that tend to gravitate towards that style, like Macallan or Aberlour, do so for similar reasons. The stills are very conducive to creating that type of whiskey. So do people enjoy this? Are people enjoying this one? This is one of my favorites. I know it's one of Brian's favorites as well. Even though I'm the Scotch guy, I think Brian has more bottles of this than I do.
I have more bottles in general, too.
I know.
No, I like bourbon. I would say this is a nice bridge between bourbon and whiskey because it has a sweet of bourbon that I'm not used to in a whiskey. Like I've had like mostly peated whiskeys, and this one doesn't have a whole lot of peat. I think it's really approachable on either end if you're a whiskey lover or bourbon lover, because it's almost like a gateway drug to either one. You know, that's the way I see it. With this one, I think it's pretty awesome.
Well, great, Scott. That's some great input. I mean, we feel the exact same way, and people who haven't drunk a lot of Scotch whiskey, sherry is a great way to get into it, to start to explore the style. Like you said, a lot of people are introduced to Scotch whiskey through peat, which is very unfortunate, but that's actually only a very small subsection of the total whiskey that's coming out of Scotland is peated whiskey. Granted, they're some of the most popular distilleries, most well-known distilleries, but it's certainly not the majority of the whiskey that's coming out of that country. So there's so much else that has to offer, and I'm glad you're seeing a little bit of that here with this great sherried Glendronic expression. It's certainly one of our favorites. You want to move on to 1897, Brian?
Yeah. So let's keep this drinking train rolling. And if everybody wants to pour the second whiskey, that will be the Old Forester 1897. So I'm gonna pour a little bit here with y'all. So,
if you have a second glass, feel free to use that. No need to chug what you may still have in your glass. No rush here.
So as I said earlier, I'm not going to walk through the formal tasting process again. Hopefully everybody was able to retain those 4 pillars. If not, shoot us an email and I can be happy to walk you through it again or give you the abbreviated Clip Notes version. So we have crossed the pond, right? So we're back in America now with bourbon, with Old Forester. So I want to talk a little bit about the differences, right? So Tim told you that, the single malt Scotch that you had earlier with the Glendronic was 100% malted barley. So all the grains were the same, right? It's all barley. In America, we really don't make our whiskey in that fashion, right? We don't really highlight, or we don't really only use a single grain. Instead, we use a combination of grains. We call that a mash bill. And so for bourbon in particular, we use, again, typically 3 grains. The primary grain is corn. That's actually part of what makes bourbon bourbon, is that it is more than 51% or more of the grains are corn. And then usually the secondary and the tertiary grain is going to be a combination of rye and a little bit of that malted barley. That malted barley is really thrown in there to help with that fermentation that Tim mentioned. It's kind of flavorless. I know that might be sacrilege to Tim's ears, but really where a lot of the flavor is coming from is going to be from that corn and that rye and that combination of the two. Now, there are some bourbons out there that skip over the rye and don't use rye, and instead they use wheat. And so those are usually called wheated bourbons. Some of you may have heard of it. Kind of the most popular wheated bourbon out there is called Papi Van Winkle. So even, some of those non-bourbon drinkers might have heard of the craze that has been going around the whiskey world with that particular brand. But again, predominantly you're dealing with corn and rye with a little bit of malted barley. And usually that corn is far above 51%. It usually hovers somewhere between 68 to 72%. And it's the interaction of the corn, of the distilled corn in a brand new charred oak barrel that creates what we interpret as vanilla or sweet. So that's actually where you're getting a lot of those vanilla notes. And I definitely get a lot more vanilla off of this bourbon than I did with the Glendronic. And the reason that you tend to get some of those vanilla notes off of scotches, perhaps not just the Glendronic, but as Tim mentioned, most of the bourbon or most of the scotch is actually aged in X, or formerly used bourbon barrels. Why? Well, I kind of hinted at it before, glossed right over it for those who weren't paying specific attention to every single word I mentioned, but I said bourbon has to be aged in brand new American charred oak barrels, meaning once that barrel's used, it serves zero purpose here in America for whiskey making. So a lot of these brands, Brown-Forman, for example, Tim mentioned, owns Glendronic. They also own Jack Daniels. They also happen to own this other whiskey, Old Forester, which we're also having tonight. And so ex-Jack Daniel barrels, ex-Old Forester barrels, they find their way over to Brown-Forman Scotch companies, right? Whether they be Ben Riach, Glenglashau, or just clearinghouses in general, right? For other distilleries. Lefroy, one of the, Scott may be familiar with this, one of the more peated whiskeys. Their parent company, Beam Suntory, also owns Maker's Mark. So all of the ex-bourbon barrels that go to Lefroy are actually coming from Maker's Mark distillery. So it's the whiskey world is small yet, global at the same time. So that's kind of the other. Those are the two major differences, right? There's a host of stuff we can get into with what makes bourbon and Scotch so different within the kind of the umbrella of what whiskey is. But the two major differences are kind of the grains themselves. So again, Scotch is going to be 100% malted barley. Bourbon is going to be a combination of Again, 3 grains, typically rye and malted barley with a majority of corn. And it's going to be aged in a brand new charred oak barrel. So what do I mean by charred oak? I mean, the inside of that barrel has seen fire. It has seen flame. It has seen it for maybe 30 seconds, and it will be kind of a light, like a toast that you wouldn't mind putting a little bit of butter on, all the way to a char level 4, which is a little over a minute and a half. And the inside of that barrel is now going to look really black and like alligator skin. It's going to be very scaly, very flaky, almost like you left a log in the, in one of those fire pits for way too long, and it's just all kind of seared up and charred. The reason for that charring is that it kind of breaks apart the molecules in that oak. It also kind of allows the whiskey itself to penetrate the oak deeper and faster. That's really important because, again, as Tim mentioned, all of the color that you're getting out of the whiskey is coming from the time it spends in the oak. And about 70 to 80% of the flavors you're getting are actually coming from the oak barrel itself. So the more that whiskey can penetrate into the oak, the better. So before I talk a little bit about what makes this bourbon a little bit extra special, does anybody have any questions in general about bourbon?
Again, if this is a little bit too strong for you, please don't hesitate to put a little bit of water, or even if you want to put a little ice in this whiskey. That's a great way to kind of mellow it out. As far as ice is concerned, it works well with bourbons and ryes, but tend to shy away from that as far as scotches are concerned. Barley is a little bit more of a delicate grain as compared to corn or rye, so the flavors really end up getting suppressed and muted if the temperature gets chilled. So, but bourbons and ryes hold up much better to that. So don't be shy.
Absolutely. So so this Old Forester has a number, right? We called it the Old Forester 1897. That actually does refer to the year 1897. And I don't know if anybody knows why that was a very important year. I will tell you now, not hearing anybody jump right at it. It was the year that the United States of America, the Congress, passed the first Consumer Protection Act. So a year before we passed the Food and Drug Act, right? So before we regulated the food or the drugs that we put in our body, we passed something known as the Bottled and Bond Act because we regulated whiskey, because we cared more about what was going into our whiskey than what was going into our food or our drugs. And there was a really good reason for it. People were putting really bad stuff in whiskey. And the reason for that was the way in which whiskey was sold, and the way whiskey was transported, and the way whiskey was so desirable, right? And kind of we're back in that, minus the first stuff, right? We're back in that kind of really desirable market right now. We're in a kind of a little bit of a whiskey craze or a whiskey boom, which is great for Tim and I, for both, one, there's plenty of whiskey to drink, and two, we get to talk to people like you all about it. Now, so in 1897, we passed the Bottled and Bond Act. So whiskey up to this point, and a couple of years before that, were really only sold in barrels, right? You could really only drink whiskey at a saloon or a pub or a bar. You weren't really bringing whiskey into your own home to drink. It was actually Old Forester who were the first people to actually bottle their own whiskey. And so they put it in bottles. And that was actually the first step of being able to regulate whiskey. The second step came in the Bottled and Bond Act, which I'll get to in a second. So the reason for all of this is that if you can imagine being in a saloon, let's say out west, and you had all of your distilleries making this whiskey in Kentucky, or I think it may be in that point, what we might call just the Western Annex of Virginia, was that when that barrel got about halfway done, right? Because you were the bartender was ladling kind of whiskey into your shot glass. When that barrel got about half done, the bartender would look around and be like, "Oh, I don't really have that much money or that time to order another one. Let's just dump some water in." So he'd fill that barrel back up with water. So now he's diluted your whiskey, but now what do, right? You're going to notice, right? You're going to notice that whiskey isn't as strong because it's not going to have that bite but arsenic will give you a little bit of that bite. So you'll add a little bit of arsenic to it. You'll add a little bit of tobacco leaves for coloring and all that stuff. And that was actually what was going on, is that the actual distillers in Kentucky, like Old Forester, Old Copper Fire, now Buffalo Trace, these businesses were really, really worried about their brand being tainted, and their whiskey being tainted, right? And people dying from it. And so they actually, the good folks in Kentucky actually petitioned the federal government to regulate them. A little odd, but they did. And so they asked to be regulated. They actually asked for the IRS, the tax man, to kind of come and live on their property. And that was what the Bottle and Bond Act was. The Bottle and Bond Act kind of was a guarantee, a government seal of approval that that whiskey was good and it was solid. And so they did that by passing a few major rules. Not only did it have to be a bourbon, right? So aged in new oak and everything like that, but it came with some other major requirements. First, all of the grains had to come from the same distilling season. So there's really only two distilling seasons, or I'm sorry, not distilling, growing seasons. And really what they're talking about there is harvest, spring and fall. So all the grains had to either come from the spring or the fall harvest. The other requirement was that it actually had to be bottled or aged for a minimum of 4 years. So bourbon actually doesn't have an age requirement. So bourbon just requires the whiskey to touch the oak for a second, a minute. There is no age requirement for how long that whiskey has to be in there. But for bottled and bond, it has to be aged for a minimum of 4. And then the other major thing is that all bottled and bond whiskey has to be sold at 100 proof. So 50% alcohol. There's a couple other nuances in there that we could get into, but suffice it to say that is really what was the driver behind the Bottle and Bond Act, and what Bottle and Bond did for the whiskey world was it really cemented that kind of proof that it's a good, healthy, right, or safe. It's at least not tainted with arsenic. Spirit. And so that's what this Old Forester bottle is. Old Forester about maybe 10 years ago came out with, or started the Whiskey Road series. And so there's 4 whiskeys out there that they have with 4 different years. I think it's 1870, 1897, 1910, and 1920. All 4 years relate to something that happened either in the whiskey world or to Old Forester specifically, the 1897, obviously referring to the Bottled and Bond Act. So with that, any questions, thoughts, concerns?
But
Could you
Brian,
explain-
whiskey really is healthy because Dr. Forrester prescribed it as medicine, right?
That is also true, Andrew, is that back in the Prohibition, Old Forester was one of, I think, only about 10 distilleries that were licensed to sell whiskey as medicinal spirits. And so that's actually what their 1920 whiskey is all about, is the Prohibition style of whiskey that they created during that time.
Could you explain why proof is double the alcohol content?
Great question.
It's not something that I'm 100% clear on, and that's a great question. It has to do with the UK standard, I believe, and you'll actually notice that UK proof isn't exactly 2 times the ABV like it is on the bottles these days. So whenever you see 40% alcohol, it's 80 proof, but in actuality, it has something to do with. It's a good question. Let me look into that before I BS you and get a real answer there for you, sir.
I mean, Tim and Brian, if you would allow me to add a note on that, in the time when whiskey was sold out of the barrel, like you were just talking about, and it got proof down from a lot of additives being added to it, when it was at 100 proof, drinkers could take a bullet out of their gun, because a lot of people just carried, revolvers on their person back in those days, pour out the gunpowder onto the top of the bar, drip some whiskey on it, and when they lit it, if it flashed blue, that meant that it was at least 50% alcohol, and that's how they got the 100 proof.
And it all comes down to taxes. All right, so that's why we got the proof system back then in the 1500s in England, when they wanted to tax the distillers. The higher the proof, the higher the tax, and so they would call it a proof spirit. So anything in Andrew's case, with the gunpowder, would be taxed at a higher rate. I think it was. And Tim's also right. In the UK, they changed the way in which they established the proof system. I think it was back in 1816. I think it was like 1.75, so it's slightly off. And then for America, it was 1953 that we just basically said, let's just keep the math simple. We're already drinking, and so we'll just make it times 2. And so if it's 50%, multiply that by 2, and you get 100 proof. And so that's kind of it was in America, at least that's what it was, is that they standardized proof and ABV to be kind of just double one another. And again, I'm pretty sure that was 1953.
Let's just touch on a couple other things here while we're on a similar subject. I know we did get a question in the chat, I believe, about why is bourbon and rye typically bottled at a higher strength than Scotch whiskey? So, you have any thoughts on that one, Brian?
Because it's better. No, I mean,
so it is true, right? So a lot of the Scotch bottles that you see as the everyday releases will be at 40 or 43%. You do have plenty of bourbons that come in right around the same strength, but both are expanding more broadly into cask strength or barrel proof expressions, simply because the market is clamoring for that these days. So there has been a shift. I think the reason is due in large part to the types of flavors that drinkers of each type of whiskey appreciate, right? So when you're drinking Scotch whiskey, you're much more a fan of kind of the distillery expression. You're a fan of the floral, the fruit notes. You're a fan of just some of those sweeter flavors that are coming through. So you're not looking for that necessarily that intense, super powerful flavor that a lot of bourbon and rye drinkers are looking for. Where you see a lot of your just, main expressions from a given bourbon distillery are coming in at, say, 47% alcohol. And I think that's because the bourbon drinkers' tolerance is a little bit higher maybe than Scotch whiskey drinkers' tolerance for that. That being said, as a Scotch whiskey drinker, 47-50% is a really nice strength to be drinking Scotch. And because you have that perfect mix between alcohol and alcohol and water, and it allows for kind of the best flavors contained within that spirit to come out. And it also gives the drinker an opportunity to dilute it, him or herself, down to a more manageable strength. So it means if you're doing that, you're actually getting more mileage out of the bottle, as opposed to having it come out at that lower strength in the same volume from the store shelf. So as a drinker, I do enjoy those little bit higher strengths. And just to talk about age really quickly, Brian mentioned that bourbon doesn't have an age requirement other than the fact that it simply needs to touch new charred oak. Scotch whiskey has a minimum of 3-year requirement, and that's really has to do a lot with the climate in Scotland. So Scotland is a much more even, milder climate than you find in a place like Kentucky. Obviously, not all bourbon has to come from Kentucky, but that's where the majority of it does come from. And you get a lot higher, warmer temperatures and cooler during the day and cooler temperatures in the evening, and between seasons as well. There are large fluctuations. And that causes for a faster maturation. And so if you were to allow a bourbon to age for the same period of time as we had on that Glendronic 18, which means it was aged for 18 years, you would only be tasting the wood of that bourbon, and it wouldn't be very enjoyable for anybody. So that's why you're not going to see much, if any, bourbon bottled beyond 18 years. You do see a handful of them show up every now and then. Obviously, Papi 23, Heaven Hill did an old 27-year release a couple years ago, but those are the exception. There are not very many of those coming through. And also the amount of evaporation that takes place in America as compared to Scotland is much, much higher, meaning that if you were to let it sit for 18 or 20 years, out of the original contents of that filled barrel, you're likely to only have 15 or 20% of it left over because the angel share would have taken the rest. And it happens in Scotland too, but just to a lesser extent. And so climate and warehouses are a difference between the two countries as well. Scotland uses more traditional dunnage warehouses, where the barrels are only stacked a couple barrels high. There obviously are larger rick houses, as they call them in Scotland as well, but those are the main styles of warehouses in America, where you have warehouses that are 9, 10, 11 barrels high, where you have huge temperature fluctuations within the warehouse, and it allows for the whiskeys to mature at very different rates. Just even whiskeys that were distilled at the same time and bottled at the same time will have a completely different flavor profile at the end as a result of that type of warehouse. Thoughts, questions? We move on to the Rittenhouse, Brian?
Yeah, let's move on to number 3. So for the third one, we're going to pour the Rittenhouse Rye. So I'll also join you, because why not? It's Monday. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier, right? We mentioned, or I mentioned, I should say, not we, I mentioned it, right? So Tim at the very beginning with the Glendronic was focused in on barley. I mentioned that in America, we use a multitude of grains. In bourbon, it's predominantly corn. The corn is the predominant grain, right? It's over 51%, followed by rye, and then a little bit of barley. For a rye whiskey, that is not the case, right? So rye whiskey is more than 51% rye, followed by a little bit of corn, followed by a little bit less malted barley. So that's what you have here. You have a rye whiskey. So you have over 51%, well, over 50%, I should say, rye, and then corn is the secondary grain. Now, most ryes that you get are going to be very high in their rye content. They're going to be they're kind of the opposite of bourbon in the sense of where that corn is going to come in at that 68 to 72%. Those ryes might come in at that same percentage with rye. They can even be as high as 95% rye. What that does, that rye grain is where you're going to get that extra spice, right? That peppery note, a little bit more of that kick, and not necessarily kick in alcohol or kick in kind of, a burn, but just more of like a, and not hot, but a pepper, right? Pepper's the best thing I got for you, right? Like a black pepper, like a freshly cracked pepper. For some whiskeys though, or some rye whiskeys, they come in kind of like barely legal rye. And that's what Rittenhouse is, right? So Rittenhouse comes in at exactly 51% rye. And then a ton of corn for a rye whiskey. So I think its rye content is up there in the high 20s, low 30s, followed by a little bit of malted barley. What that means is that it's going to be a little bit of a sweeter rye. You're not going to be, so I think Scott was the one who indicated, right, that, the Glendronic 18 is kind of that gateway Scotch for a bourbon drinker. Well, Rittenhouse is kind of a gateway rye for a bourbon drinker as well, right? So if you typically do not like, the extra kick of a rye, and instead you kind of like that sweetness of a sherried whiskey, of a bourbon, then a rye made in kind of the Pennsylvania, Dutch, Maryland style, and even probably here in DC and Northern Virginia and Mount Vernon back in the day, then what you actually prefer is this kind of rye, right? Rittenhouse. And what that is, let me back up a little bit and explain rye for a second, and why I mentioned Pennsylvania and Maryland and DC and at least the northern part of Virginia. When the United States of America was colonized, right? When we were colonized and founded, we brought over a lot of people who knew how to make beer and whiskey, and thank God, because they needed it. And they originally started trying to grow barley. And as Tim mentioned, barley is a very delicate grain. It does not tolerate extreme heat or extreme cold. And if you've walked outside today at all here in the DC area, it's cold. And if you walked out, 6 months ago, it was hot, right? And barley cannot tolerate those temperature swings, right? And I'm sure when we get into, mid-March, we're going to have, a 70-degree day followed by a 40-degree day, followed by probably a 20-degree day and then an 80-degree day because, well,
Who knows?
right. It's March and it's DC. But anyway, so barley was not working, but corn was very prevalent. Right. And so corn was something that, the excess grains were being used to make whiskey. But more importantly, when the Dutch came over, they brought their rye with them. Right. You think of those rye breads and those notes that you're getting out of, they brought their rye. And unlike the barley that we tried to grow here, right, which just didn't stick, rye will grow on a rock. Right. It is a hardy grain. It can tolerate a little bit of drought. It can tolerate that high heat. It will withstand a whole lot of stuff. And for everything that grain can do naturally, right, it passes its characteristic on in the whiskey itself. So scotches tend to be a little bit lighter, tend to be a little bit more delicate, right? Ryes tend to be bold and powerful, right? Like you can imagine that rye whiskey would have no problem laying down on a rock and passing out, right? Like that's what they can do. And so that's what we're dealing with here. But just a little bit of that, right? They didn't overpower this style of whiskey. And so in this region, what they were doing is because there was so much corn and so much rye, they were they were using a percentage of both. And so whether it was exactly 51 to 49 or 51 to 30, whatever that percentage was, it was probably close to even, right? An even amount of corn and an even amount of rye back in the day was creating kind of this Pennsylvania style of rye, which was very, very good and very, very flavorful. It died off right before Prohibition, and then kind of only took a real big resurgence maybe in the last 15, 20 years. And it's thank God, because I actually really enjoy it. I think that it's a great way to enjoy a rye without, being kind of kicked in the teeth with all that spice. And for Rittenhouse in particular, Rittenhouse is one of those whiskeys that I feel like is fantastic, three ways, right? You can drink it neat, meaning you can drink it no ice, no water, nothing else in it. You can drink it over ice. It can tolerate it, right? Because it's got enough rye content in it to tolerate that. It also has enough proof coming in at another bottled and bond expression, which immediately, without looking, that's 100 proof. And then the third thing it allows it to do is it goes great in cocktails. It's also a very budget-friendly whiskey, meaning that you have no problem mixing it with cocktails and not kind of feeling bad. And so I tend to use the Rittenhouse. There is a reason that it's so low in my bottle. It goes into all my old fashions. It goes in my Manhattans. I can't say they're the greatest cocktails, but I mean the Rittenhouse definitely kind of amps it up a little bit.
Well, that's probably your fault, right, Brian?
Most likely, till the library starts paying for cocktail classes, Tim, I'm just stuck drinking it neat.
There's a reason we're the whiskey library and not the cocktail library. Absolutely.
So, right, wait, can I ask a question?
Please.
So back to your history lesson, Brian. So what I was hearing from you is that it's a very mid-Atlantic spirit. And I mean, my family's always drinking rye and I do a lot of baking with alcohol and cooking. And so with my great grandmother's recipes, and her fruit cake calls for dried fruits soaked in rye. Our eggnog calls for rye. And she was from, coastal North Carolina region. But I always thought that was interesting because you don't see that a lot in recipes. But you made a lot of sense there.
Well, good. I'm glad.
Or rather connection, that I didn't quite realize that it was such a localized grain.
Yeah, so rye definitely, I mean, the grains kind of followed their origin, right? And what they were originally used for, right? So whiskey only really came out from, farmers not wanting to waste. And so any of the excess rye, the excess corn, the excess wheat, barley, whatever it was, it would either rot over the winter being stored, right? They didn't have a proper way to store it back then. Or they could say, well, let's make whiskey and then let's drink that during the winter, and it'll make that winter a heck of a lot better. And so that's what they were doing. I love the idea of soaking fruit and then baking it too. That sounds like
It's delicious. It's
that
so
sounds
good.
like a winner right here. So we may not open a cocktail library, but we definitely might open the bakery library or something. But anyway, my point is, yeah, and I think rye was also, especially if you find it in older recipes, and why rye has now made a real big resurgence today is because of those older cocktails, those older cocktail recipes. When they said whiskey, they meant rye. All right, rye was really what was being grown or being distilled, at least here in America, right? And I'm sticking in America, right? So it was really a lot of the ryes were going into those cocktails, and same thing with kind of, I'm assuming, any of the recipes you're getting from the cooking world, if they were calling for a whiskey, I mean, if they spelled out rye, obviously rye was their intended spirit, but even whiskey in general, and they were probably calling rye out because that was really what was being used a lot, and that was really the spirit that was prevalent before Prohibition kind of not ruined it. I mean, it did. It definitely ruined it, but before it kind of almost hid it from history, right? It almost managed to erase rye's influence and rye's impact. And it wasn't until I think the late 80s, early 90s where people started realizing what that rye was, and then it just took a huge resurgence in the late 2000s.
Very cool. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Before we go on to our final whiskey, just let me transition back over to Scotland real quick. And Brian's talked about a couple different styles of American whiskey. I don't want everybody to think that, all of Scotland is single malt Scotch, because it's actually far from the case. So if you were to go over to Scotland, there are 5 different styles of Scotch whiskey. So there's single malt Scotches, like we talked about. There are blended Scotches. There are blended malts. There are single grains, and they're blended grains, right? So with blended Scotch being by far the largest category in the country, where single malts actually only make up about 7% of the volume exported from the country. And so when you talk about blended Scotch, which is the main style and is actually the main reason for all of these malt distilleries being in existence, is because blended Scotches are a mixture of malted barley whiskey with grain distilled whiskey. So when we say grain distilled whiskey, it's not done in the pot stills, it's done in column stills, similar to a bourbon, with a mixture of corn, of rye, of wheat. And it's distilled to a higher strength in order to kind of take out some of the more focused flavors that people who enjoy single malt Scotch are looking for. Blended Scotch is more of kind of an everyday drinker, a cheaper option typically, that isn't too too formidable for the average drinker. And so things like Johnny Walker, Cutty Sark, Famous Grouse, those are all blended Scotches, by far the biggest category in Scotland. Blended malts or single malts coming from multiple different distilleries. So there's really a broad range of different types of options over there. So any questions on any of that before we get into our last whiskey? I've seen a few questions come through the chat, but unfortunately I hadn't been paying close enough attention to see those pop across. Feel free to ask out loud.
Do you happen to have the bottles that you might hold up for each one of these?
Sure. So here is a bottle of the Glendronic 18. So Brian's got an Old Forester 1897 there for you. And then Brian's will leave him to show the Americans. And then our final, the Talisker 18, which is what we'll be drinking here as our last whiskey. So let's go.
One more question on
Yes,
the
please.
last one, the Talisker. Just, I find the shape of the bottles for advertising is interesting, as is the label styles, but is that almost like a decanter or something in the top part of the bottle? Just stylish.
I think it's very much a personal preference. You do see a lot of Scotch whiskey bottles in this style, and I think it harkens back to what they call a boil ball on the side of a still, which is a little part that kind of edges out in the middle of the neck of the still. And the reason for that is to kind of increase it's to force the whiskey back down into the pot of the still to be redistilled and to become lighter when it goes back up. And so it'll only escape that part of the still once it has become light enough to move beyond it. So that's my thought as far as the shape of those bottles. But it's a very common style as far as Scotches are concerned. And you're absolutely right. It's on both of these two that I just held up. So let's move on to that. Let's move on to that final whiskey here, and everybody get your final glass and pour this, and you'll realize there's a reason why we've had this one. We've saved it till the end, and for a reason that Scott alluded to earlier on, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a second. Just first a little bit of history and geographical information about the distillery. So Talisker is from the Isle of Skye, which is an island off the western coast of Scotland, and it's actually the only distillery on this island. It's one of the most remote distilleries in the country. And so it had some rocky days early on, simply due to the fact that there weren't enough people to work at the distillery. They had trouble getting casks into the distillery and getting them out, getting their whiskey out. So it was founded in 1830 on, I think I noticed somebody on this call this evening with the last name Mcleod. That's actually really important part of Talisker's history. The Talisker distillery was built on land that was held by the clan Mcleod. And a funny little anecdote is in 1892, when their original lease came back up, they negotiated a price of 23 pounds and 12 pence, in addition to a 10-gallon cask of their finest malt whiskey each year. So they knew what they had on their hands with this distillery, and they wanted to make sure that they got a good amount for their group. So,
Tim, this is Bill Mcleod. We visited the distillery a couple of years ago. Been there, drunk it, loved it.
Yeah, it's Brian and I are planning a trip for 2022, and our plan is to certainly get over to Skye and take in the distillery and Skye in general. So we're really.
I'll reach out to you and offer you some suggestions.
We'd love that. That would be very much appreciated. Thank you, sir. So anyway, this is one of the more well-known distilleries now. It persevered and is now owned by Diageo, which is pretty much the biggest whiskey conglomerate in the world right now. And a couple notable things is the peat aspect to it. So you remember back to the beginning when I was walking you through how malted barley became such an important part of whiskey, and how it's the only grain component in single malt Scotch. So it's typically dried with a dry heat in the kiln, but in the case of Talisker and other distilleries that peat their whiskey, they will actually do it they will add peat to that kiln. And so what peat is essentially is dried boggy earth material, right? So if you can picture like really marshy kind of swamp land, really spongy earth, that's bog in its natural, that's peat in its natural environment. So what they would do is they would go and they would harvest the dirt, right? And they would let it dry for a period of months. And it is a fuel source, right? So the reason it's used with Talisker and with the distilleries from Islay, which is where the majority of the peated whiskeys come from, is because they didn't have access to fuel sources like coal back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. So they heated their homes with peat. And if they wanted to make whiskey, they had to use peat as the fuel source to dry their barley. So they could obviously choose not to use peat these days and do it the way that the majority of other distilleries do it, but to adhere to kind of their heritage and their lineage, they continue to peat their whiskey. And so what that means is you're putting these bricks of dried peat on top of this more dense fuel, and this is causing a smoky flavor to penetrate into the barley as it's drying. And that stays in the barley throughout the entire whiskey making process and all the way through its time in the cask as well. But an interesting little note there, the younger a whiskey is, the more prevalent those peat flavors are going to be. So when you're drinking this 18-year, which is a very nicely aged Scotch whiskey, you are going to have much less of a peat experience than you would if you were drinking, say, a Talisker 8 or a 10-year-old, right? The cask would not have had as much time to exert its influence in that shorter period of time. But during those subsequent 8 to 10 years, the cask really starts to take over. But 18 years is a real sweet spot where you have a nice harmony of the peat and the oak flavors coming together. And so that's one of the reasons that Brian and I enjoy this expression so much, is because we really believe it to be that sweet spot. So for those of you who maybe had a Lefroy 10, or you've had some kind of an Ardbeg or something before and said, gosh, this isn't for me, this one might kind of show you that there's a lot more to peated whiskey than the most intense examples of the style. So Talisker 18, 18 years from these other distilleries as well are really going to give you a nice balanced expression, between cask and distillery characteristics.
So I'm going to mention two things real quick on this one, right? And so, Scott, I'm going to have to put a check in the mail because I think you actually nailed it, right? I was originally, when we created this tasting, we were really going for kind of the whiskeys that you needed to have on your bar. And really what we've ended up doing is creating 4 gateway whiskeys, right? We've really created gateway whiskeys, right? So if you are a little more on the bourbon side and you want to get into Scotch, grab that Glendronic 18. If you are, you should all like bourbon, so I don't know what the heck the problem would be there. But the 1897 is actually the one to go with too. I guess it's a great gateway to bourbon if you're not really into the most amazing spirit in the world. But then that rye, right? That Rittenhouse with that lower rye content is kind of your gateway into rye. And the Talisker 18, right, being 18 years old, is really a gateway into the peated world of Scotch. So anyway, I think we're going to now start using gateway whiskey from here on out for all of these. But yeah, no, it's amazing. The other thing I wanted to mention was, I know Tim mentioned 18 years, and Tim, I don't remember. Did you get into age statement and that it's?
I vaguely alluded to it.
Yeah. So Tim's hinting at this whole idea that his scotches are 18 years old, right? But like in reality, they're probably actually older. And so that age statement actually only refers to the youngest barrel that went into making, or in Tim's case, he uses the word cask in Scotland. So the youngest cask that went into that whiskey was 18 years old. But it's really a blend, or what we'll call, I guess, a vatting, or a mixture, a marrying of multiple casks. And so it's the youngest cask, or the youngest portion of that cask. Even a tablespoon or a teaspoon was 18 years, but you're probably going to have much older whiskey, 1920. The older you get, the less you're also going to have of it. But it's really to kind of create that consistent profile for every single batch. So just
just don't want people to get confused there. So Brian's talking about many barrels coming together to make a single bottling. So let's just go back to the term that I used at the beginning. So single malt Scotch does not mean it's all coming from one barrel, okay? It just means it's coming from one distillery. And so in order for a distillery to have a consistent offering on store shelves all the time, they have to bring a lot of different casks together, because casks mature at different rates and produce different whiskeys. So based off of the types of climates that have been experienced over the life of a given cask, it may taste drastically different than another one that had either a much colder or a much warmer period of maturation. And so the distillery has people whose sole job is to make sure that each time you go and you buy a Glendronic 18 or a Talisker 18 or whatever other whiskey you enjoy drinking, is that it's as similar as possible to the previous time that you had bought it, right? But it is a very, very tough job, but it sounds like a really good job. But there are ways to experience individual casks, right? So those would be single casks, single malts, right? So that would be a way to have a bottle that would only have, a cask that would only yield 170 bottles, say. And then there would never be any more whiskey like that ever again, because each cask is extremely unique. And for people who haven't drunk a lot of whiskey, this might seem like, a lot of BS, but I promise you it's really not. If you were to taste two casks side by side in a warehouse that were distilled on the exact same day, it's very likely that those two casks would taste drastically different. You might think that they would, have been, 4 or 5 years apart from each other, when that's not the case. It's really a very, very interesting thing to explore when you get into the weeds on that.
This is Sam. I have a quick question. It's probably more for the bourbon, because that's just where I've seen it, but kind of on what you guys were just talking about. On the labels, every now and then you see single barrel or small batch. What does that refer to?
Small batch is BS. It just means it's
not BS.
Smaller. It absolutely is BS, Brian. It just means it's smaller than their normal batches, right? So like Elijah Craig's small batch is small batch because they can't have an age statement on it anymore, right? So it doesn't mean that they're using fewer casks. It just means that they had to remove the age statement and they wanted to call it something still.
But it's smaller than the regular batch. It's not complete bullshit. BS.
Okay.
My liquor store guy in New York used to say, because I went in with the exact same question like 10 years ago, and he's like, a large batch, high quality spirit is going to be much better than a small batch, low quality spirit. It doesn't matter the size of the batching. It's just marketing.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm just trying to give Tim some, we don't get to do this too often. Usually we're on our own tasting. So it's been a while since we've been able to do the back and forth, but yeah, no, small batch, it's a marketing ploy. It's exactly that. I think to the question about single barrel is kind of what Tim was referring to on the Scotch side of single cask. So single barrel means it all came from one specific barrel. So, Jack Daniels obviously makes a single barrel expression. And there's a bunch of other ones out there in the whiskey world. Blanton's, for example, is a single barrel. Russell's makes a lot of single barrels. All of those are going to be instances, especially where they're mass marketed, where the distillery is going to bottle those barrels and age them and be very, very careful with them from almost day one to make sure that they come out consistent. Because that's really what the whole game, the name of the game here is in the whiskey world, is to create a consistent product so that you keep going back time after time after time and continue to buy just that one brand and that one expression.
But as you can see, Brian and I aren't very good at that. So we like a little bit of diversity.
Has climate change impacted any aspects of whiskey production, either in like crop yields or aging?
So probably not at the scale yet. And I do say yet, right? And I have no problem with that. But it's definitely going to cause some impacts. It's going to move. What we can say already is the aging of whiskey is 100% dependent on the climate. The growing of the grain is also dependent on the climate. We mentioned that barley doesn't grow in the mid-Atlantic. So if all of a sudden the region where barley is currently growing starts to have temperature fluctuations the way that the mid-Atlantic does, then we've got a really big problem. The easiest way to kind of explain that, though, or demonstrate that, is if you look at some of these other great countries that are making really good whiskey. So Taiwan, India, and so for that I would refer to Cavalon or Amaret, or even if you go down to Balcones down in Texas, you've got 3 climates that get really, really hot, but they also get really, really cold. And so that huge temperature fluctuations, and those huge seasonal changes are really what kind of accelerates the whiskey aging process. So you can get really good whiskey from Taiwan or India at a younger age, made in the style of Scotch, right? 100% malted barley, at a younger age than what you might be able to get out of Scotland, because of Scotland's kind of more consistent temperate climate. So it will change. It will change things. I don't know if it'll change it next year or in 20 years, but there will be changes, especially in the wood making process too. Sorry. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this is going to impact everything in trees, in peat, right? In the peat bogs being able to be replenished, erosion, all sorts of stuff are going to be impacted by climate change.
This is John. I wonder if you guys could speak to, I know one of the interesting things about the whiskey industry is obviously the lag between planning for future years and actually selling your product is a lot longer than it is in other supply chains. So, kind of how do the companies that you guys work with and other people try to stay ahead of that as best they can?
Well, yeah, I think you've seen that in recent years, if you pay attention to the industry, that a number of companies haven't done a very good job of it, right? Specifically in Japan, right? They've had major shortages of their older whiskeys simply because they couldn't have forecasted how popular their style of whiskey would become, in the mid 2010s. And so they ran out of whiskey, essentially. And so they've had to take age statements off, right? So we were talking about these 18s. They would remove that because simply they just wouldn't have enough stock in order to accommodate that expression anymore. And we talked about that a little bit with Elijah Craig. That's happening more and more. So when you see those age statements being removed, that's indicative of a company that hasn't been able to forecast accurately. And nobody really has any idea what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in 10 years from now. So it is really anybody's guess. And obviously they have a lot of smart people who are analyzing trends and projecting how things are going to look in 10 or 12 years, but it's really anybody's guess. So, it affects all of the distilleries that become popular. However, if nobody were drinking it, then those whiskeys would remain available. So it's a good problem to have at the end of the day, right? They just have to adapt to the current environment.
I've got a question for you guys, and since you are the whiskey library, and it's a two-parter. Part A is, do you sell Uncle Nearest? And part B is, do you know when they will start using their own distillate?
So first off, we don't sell any whiskey, right? So we are completely an educational company. We just work with other companies who will provide the whiskey. So we're not making any money off of any whiskey sales. So, but as far as Uncle Nearest, Brian, do you have any knowledge as to what's going on with them right now?
That's a great question. I know. So one of our friends, one of our good friends in the area, Tracy Franklin, works with them. And so I can certainly reach out to her and see what's going on. But no, I know that they are going to wait until it's ready, right? The way that they have positioned themselves is to ensure that what they are kind of creating is a quality product, right? Behind a quality name. And so I think that it'll probably be I mean, it's kind of, it's a very similar problem what John was getting to, right? In the sense of, in order to be able to sell it at the market, you know, to the market that they need to, they got to ramp up production, and it's going to take a long time for them to get the production up and the aging to the right volume. So what they don't want to go out with is they don't want to go out with a younger, limited release that's not ready, right? You don't want to jump into that pond too quickly. So so to answer your question, no, I don't, but I'm more than happy to figure that out. And we can definitely give them a call this week and see what the plans are.
I'll put my info in the chat.
Yeah, please do.
Anybody else? I know we're starting to run over here a little bit. Meredith, Allison, any questions, comments, thoughts?
Could you tell us the ABVs on the Talisker and the Glendronic?
Do we need to know that, Andrew?
I'd like that.
Talisker will come in at 45.8, and Glendronic comes in at 46.
Okay, thank you.
Also, what are the general retail prices for these bottles for like a 750 milliliter?
Onyx probably 170 bucks. Talisker's in the same ballpark. Brian stuff's a lot cheaper.
Well, wait a minute. Well, okay. But it comes in at a higher proof, and so it is much more value for your money.
It's a value bottle. They're value bottles. That's right.
Just saying. So yeah. So Glen, yeah, I think last we checked in, Glendronic was at 200. Talisker like 180, 185. Rittenhouse is going to be your best value. I think that comes in at like 25. And then the Old Forester, the 1897, I think is about a $55 bottle. Give or take, depending on where you buy it. Virginia is great for bourbon. You might want to cross the border too if you want to get Scotch.
DC border.
Yeah. Don't go south.
Oh, the lady at the liquor store where we got our tasting packs loves you guys. She was singing your praises.
Oh, we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thanks for passing that along. They're great. We love the folks at Wardman. Hopefully everybody had a good experience picking up their sample bottles.
Yeah.
Super easy.
You got a great online selection, and since you all went there, they also have amazing wine. And so any if you guys are into wine at all, like they will hook you up with whatever you want. So
Picked up a bottle of Lagavulin when I did my pickup.
absolutely.
Nice. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think
there's a question in the chat, Tim.
Oh, okay. I wasn't monitoring my chat as well as I should. I apologize. Has the whiskey library tried any Copper Fox malts or ryes? God, it's been ages. Didn't we do that in one of our early tastings, Brian?
We did. Are they the ones who make
They do Wassman's, right?
do they? They make Wassman's.
I believe so. God, it's been ages, unfortunately. Obviously, like I said, I grabbed. Yeah, okay. Thanks for filling us in. But yeah, so we definitely used them in a tasting. Gosh, that was probably 2015, huh, Brian? And yeah, but I can't say that I've had much recently, unfortunately. Have you tried anything?
Me?
Inventory.
Yeah, I feel like I have it somewhere, but
So unfortunately, the answer is we haven't tried too much of it recently, but I know they're putting out a lot of good stuff. There are so many distilleries out there right now that it's just impossible to stay on top of everybody, but they are doing some great stuff locally. So if you enjoy them, obviously, please continue to keep supporting them. There you go. Yep.
and then they make these great white dogs.
Nice.
So yeah,
Unaged whiskey.
there's a lot of whiskey in this place.
Great.
Any final questions, anyone? Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Brian and Tim. This was such a special treat. I know Meredith is having some audio issues. I know she would love to express her gratitude right now. But thank you all for joining us. This also was recorded, so we will have this posted for you guys on our alumni event recordings page. And if you have any questions for Brian, Tim, anything that comes up, please feel free to email Meredith and me, and we will connect you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. This
Again,
was
thanks
wonderful.
everybody for joining. We really appreciate it. Stay safe.
Thank you. Happy
Thank you.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.